There is a snake in Ohio, not a living one. This one is made of earth and stone, and it is longer than 4 football fields laid end to end. It sits on a ridge above a creek in Adams County, coiled and curving through the trees, its mouth wide open as if swallowing something enormous. Nobody knows who built it. Nobody knows exactly when, and nobody knows why. You cannot see all of it from the ground, not the way it was meant to be seen. The builders knew that when they shaped the soil thousands of years ago, they were creating something that only the sky could witness in full. Something that would outlast empires. Something that would outlast them so completely that their names would vanish forever while their creation remained day after day, year after year, watched by clouds and stars. If you stand at the eastern tip of the serpent where its tail spirals 3 times, you are standing at the apex of a ridge 425 feet above Ohio Brush Creek, in the rolling hill country that used to be Appalachia before Appalachia had a name. The earth beneath your feet carries millennia. The water below carries millennia, but this snake, this earthwork that spans 1,348 feet in one unbroken line, reaches farther into mystery than either the stone or the stream. The serpent's body is 3 feet tall and roughly 20 feet wide, built from the local earth itself, so carefully integrated into the ridge that early European explorers who first glimpsed it thought it might be a natural formation, a freak of erosion or geology that merely resembled a creature. But as you walk along its length, as your footsteps trace the path that thousands of others have traced before you, you begin to understand that this is no accident of nature. Every curve was deliberate. Every measurement was planned. The serpent's neck is graceful and long, stretching northward. The body coils back on itself 7 times, 7 great loops that descend the ridge like a staircase made of biology instead of stone. Each loop is roughly 300 feet in diameter. The engineers, if you can call the skilled builders that, understood the mathematics of space and proportion in ways that modern archaeologists still struggle to explain. And then comes the head, and the head is where everything changes. The serpent's mouth is open, impossibly open, gaping. As if in the moment of its creation, the builder froze the creature in the act of consuming something. In front of the mouth, directly in the creature's path, sits a perfect oval shape. Some have called it an egg. Others insist it is the sun. A few researchers have suggested it might be a frog, and those researchers are usually quietly ignored at academic conferences. But the oval is there, undeniable, roughly 80 feet long, waiting in the serpent's mouth like a cosmic meal, like a world held on the creature's tongue. Walking along this mound in the spring or early summer, when the grass is thick and the trees form a canopy overhead, you might not notice how perfectly the oval aligns with the serpent's jaws. You might be too focused on the earth beneath your feet, too aware of the weight of years pressing down on your shoulders. But climb the water tower that stands nearby, climb 50 feet into the air where tourists and historians have climbed before you, and suddenly the geometry becomes clear. The serpent is not coiled randomly. The oval is not accidentally placed. Whoever built this, and whenever they built it, they understood that meaning could be written onto the landscape itself. They understood that you could encode a message in dirt and stone that would survive longer than any painted word or carved symbol ever could. The first European-trained scholars to seriously examine Serpent Mound were 2 men named Ephraim Squire and Edwin Davis. They arrived in Ohio in 1846, sent by the Smithsonian Institution to catalogue and measure the elaborate earthworks that dotted the landscape of what was then the frontier. There were hundreds of them back then, thousands even, built by peoples whose names had been erased from history as thoroughly as footprints are erased from sand. Squire and Davis were there to document them before they disappeared entirely, buried under ploughed fields and town councils and the relentless westward push of American settlement. They found Serpent Mound and they measured it with the scientific precision that their era demanded. They drew it, they mapped it, they published their findings in an enormous leather-bound volume that became one of the first systematic catalogues of American archaeology. Their work was meticulous, almost obsessive. They understood that they were witnessing something profound and significant, something that connected the people of Ohio in 1846 to a past so distant that the connection was almost metaphysical. The question they asked, the question that every subsequent investigator has asked, was simple but impossible to answer. Who did this, and why? For most of the 19th century, the accepted answer was the Adena culture. The Adena were not a single unified people, but rather a complex of related societies that flourished across the Ohio River Valley from roughly 800 before Christ to 100 after. They built mounds, hundreds of them, some for burials, some for ceremonies, some for purposes that we will never fully understand. They were sophisticated, they were organized, they had trade networks that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. And when archaeologists looked at Serpent Mound in the context of Adena culture, everything seemed to fit. The mound-building tradition was Adena. The location in Ohio was Adena territory. The age seemed to align. The Adena had been in the region long enough, and had the organisational capacity to undertake such a massive project. For decades, for more than a century even, the case seemed closed. Serpent Mound was Adena. Mystery solved. The people of that era had built it during their heyday, perhaps as a religious statement, perhaps as a territorial marker, perhaps as something more esoteric that our modern minds could not quite grasp. But then came the radiocarbon dating. In 1996, researchers collected samples from Serpent Mound and subjected them to modern dating techniques that would have seemed like pure science fiction to Squire and Davis. The results were shocking. The dates came back suggesting that the mound was much younger than everyone had assumed. Instead of 800 before Christ, the serpent appeared to have been built around 1070 after Christ. That would place it in the cultural period known as Fort Ancient, named after another Ohio archaeological site. Fort Ancient peoples were the successors to the Adena in many ways, but they were not the same people. They had different technologies, different artistic traditions, different social structures. The debate that erupted in response to these findings has never fully settled. Some researchers defended the original Adena attribution, suggesting that the radiocarbon dates were contaminated or misinterpreted. Others embraced the Fort Ancient hypothesis, which would mean that Serpent Mound was built nearly 2,000 years after the decline of Adena civilization. The truth is that both cultures were mound builders. Both cultures were present in Ohio. Both cultures had the capacity and the organization to undertake a project of this magnitude, and yet we have only one serpent. We have only one mound to study, and the evidence, frustratingly, does not definitively prove which culture created it. There are clues scattered throughout the landscape, fragments of pottery and stone tools and the occasional burial mound nearby, but none of these fragments definitively resolve the question. The Fort Ancient dates are intriguing, but not conclusive. The Adena tradition of mound building is well documented but not proven in this specific case. The mystery remains, and mysteries, especially mysteries that have lasted this long, have a way of becoming more compelling the more you examine them. But the mystery of Serpent Mound only deepens when you begin to consider its location. The mound sits on a ridge above Ohio Brush Creek, and that ridge is not ordinary geology. Beneath it, hidden in the rock layers and soil profiles that geologists have spent decades mapping and analysing, lies evidence of something catastrophic. The entire ridge, the entire region, sits directly above what scientists call a crypto-explosion structure. A crypto-explosion is what happens when a meteorite strikes the Earth with such tremendous force that it leaves not a crater, but a series of shocked rock formations and shattered mineral patterns. The crypto-explosion structure beneath Serpent Mound is roughly 4 miles in diameter. It was created based on analysis of the mineral damage and the geological disturbances approximately 300 million years ago. 300 million years. That is a time span so vast that the human mind struggles to grasp it. The dinosaurs that would eventually roam North America had not yet evolved. The continents themselves were in different positions. The world was younger and fiercer and stranger. A stone from space, perhaps a quarter-mile across, perhaps larger, struck the Earth directly beneath what would eventually become Adams County, Ohio. The impact would have been cataclysmic. The explosion would have been visible from hundreds of miles away. The shock wave would have flattened forests. The impact would have altered the local geology in ways that persisted for eons. And 300 million years later, long after the impact crater had been buried and obscured and integrated into the landscape, human beings deliberately chose to build their sacred serpent directly on top of the impact site. They chose to place their most significant earthwork, their greatest artistic and engineering achievement, at a location that marked the collision point of a world and a space stone. Now, coincidence is a powerful argument. Coincidence is often the correct answer. But consider that the builders had choices. They had an entire landscape available to them. They had ridges and valleys and open spaces where they could have inscribed their serpent. They had proximity to rivers and sources of food and all the resources they would need, and yet they chose this specific ridge. They chose the location marked by cosmic catastrophe. They aligned their greatest creation with the scar of a cosmic impact site. Was this conscious? Did they know about the crypto-explosion structure beneath their feet? Could they have understood that something unusual lay below the surface? The answers to these questions seem impossible, and yet the fact remains. The builders knew something about this place. The place itself held significance. The earth beneath the serpent was not ordinary earth, and the beings who shaped it were not ordinary craftspeople. But the shape of the serpent is only part of the mystery. What it was built to do is what will really keep you awake tonight. Consider first the astronomical alignments. Researchers have pointed out that the serpent's mouth, the open jaws that frame the oval, appear to align with the solstice sun and the cardinal directions in ways that suggest intentional design. The head of the serpent faces a particular direction. The oval in its mouth catches light at specific times of the year. Some have suggested that Serpent Mound was an astronomical calendar, a way of tracking the seasons and the movement of celestial bodies across the sky. Others have gone further, suggesting that the mound encoded knowledge of planetary movements or stellar phenomena that should not have been known by a culture without telescopes or advanced mathematics. These suggestions are controversial, and rightly so. They venture into territory that makes mainstream archaeologists uncomfortable. They suggest knowledge that doesn't fit neatly into our understanding of pre-colonial American cultures, but they also fit the evidence. They explain why such enormous effort was expended on this particular form and this particular location. A calendar in the sky, a message written to the gods or to the stars themselves, a way of speaking to something larger than human society, a way of saying, we are here, we are watching, we understand. Then consider the ceremonial possibilities. Mounds were gathering places. People would come to them for rituals and celebrations and the sacred events that marked the turning of the seasons. Serpent Mound, with its enormous size and its striking visual form, would have been an ideal gathering place. Picture standing on the serpent's back at dawn, surrounded by your community watching the sunrise. Consider the rituals that might have taken place here, the dances and the chants and the offerings made to whatever powers the builders believed controlled the world around them. The serpent would have been alive with meaning. It would have pulsed with significance. It would have been a place where the ordinary and the sacred came together, where humans reached upward and the earth reached back down to meet them. And then there is the theory that has slowly gained traction among more adventurous researchers. The theory that Serpent Mound was not built by humans at all. This theory is not mainstream. It is not accepted in academic circles, but it persists, whispered about in certain circles, suggested in certain books and documentaries. It suggests that Serpent Mound shows evidence of design that is too perfect, too sophisticated, too cosmically aligned to have been created by the indigenous peoples of Ohio. This theory suggests visitors from the stars. It suggests extraterrestrial architects or visitors from the stars who came to Earth and left their marks on the landscape. This theory is almost certainly wrong. The evidence strongly suggests that Serpent Mound was built by humans using human technology and human labour. The soil composition is consistent with local Earth. The building techniques are consistent with other mounds of the era. The cultural context is human. And yet, the precision is undeniable. The cosmic alignment is real. The location on top of a meteor impact site is true. These facts remain. And they suggest a level of knowledge and intention that invites the most elaborate explanations our imaginations can generate. What we are left with, after all the research and all the radiocarbon dating and all the theories and all the speculation, is a multi-millennium mystery preserved in dirt and clay. A serpent that nobody built. A mouth that swallows an oval that nobody can identify. A creation that serves a purpose that nobody fully understands. It sits on a ridge above Ohio Brush Creek on a clear day, and the sky stretches above it endlessly. And if you climb high enough, if you rise above the trees in a small plane or a drone, you can finally see the creature whole. You can see it the way it was meant to be seen. You can finally comprehend the vision that existed in the minds of its builders, whether they lived 800 before Christ or 1,000 after. You can see the serpent in its entirety. And in that moment you understand that whoever created this was trying to speak to something beyond themselves. They were leaving a message for someone who could see from above. They were writing a story in stone and earth that could only be fully read from the sky. The story of Serpent Mound does not begin with its discovery in the 1800s. It begins long before that, in a time when Europeans had not yet learned to sail across oceans in search of new worlds. The mound stood silent and still for centuries, watched by the same peoples who may or may not have built it, inhabited by creatures both large and small, slowly settling deeper into the earth as rain and snow and the relentless passage of seasons did their work. In the years before written history reached Ohio, native peoples would have known of Serpent Mound. They would have walked upon it. They may have performed ceremonies there. They may have understood something of its purpose that has been lost to time. The Adena, if they were the builders, created it during a period of their civilization when mound building was reaching its height, when Ohio River Valley communities were becoming increasingly sophisticated and organized. They understood architecture and engineering. They understood social cooperation on a grand scale. They understood how to mobilize hundreds of people toward a common goal. But even with all that knowledge, creating Serpent Mound would have been an undertaking of staggering proportions. Consider the logistics. Consider the labour. To create a 1,300-foot mound, 3 feet tall and 20 feet wide, using only hand tools and human strength, required the coordination of hundreds of workers over an extended period. There was no machinery, there were no horses to carry earth, there were no wheeled vehicles. Everything had to be moved by hand or carried in baskets or dragged on wooden sleds across uneven terrain. And the work had to be done with precision. The lines had to be straight enough that when viewed from above, they would create a recognizable creature. The curves had to be smooth and intentional. The proportions had to be carefully calculated. This was not a casual project. This was not something done quickly. This was a permanent statement, carved into the landscape itself, designed to endure. The fort ancient peoples, if they were the builders instead, would have had some advantages that the earlier Adena did not. They had more advanced tools. They had greater agricultural sophistication. They had organized states and more complex social hierarchies. They were the inheritors of the mound-building tradition, though the tradition was changing by their era. Fort ancient cultures began to shift away from the massive ceremonial mounds of their predecessors. They built smaller mounds. They built different kinds of structures, and yet the radiocarbon evidence suggests they may have created this serpent, this enormous throwback to an earlier tradition. If that is true, then Serpent Mound was something of an anachronism, a return to the old ways, a statement that even as culture changed, some truths remained constant, some mysteries remained sacred, some messages still needed to be written to the sky. The preservation of Serpent Mound is itself a story worth telling. By the time Ephraim Squire and Edwin Davis arrived in the 1800s, American farmers had already begun the process of destroying Ohio's ceremonial mounds. Plows turned up burial goods, axes cleared mounds for fields. The westward expansion of settlement was careless and destructive toward archaeological sites. Serpent Mound survived largely because of its size, and because it was located on private land that happened to be owned by people who understood its value. But by the late 1800s, even this protection was not enough. Development was approaching. The mound was threatened. Frederick Ward Putnam, a Harvard archaeologist and museum curator, took action. Putnam was not a wealthy man, but he understood the importance of preservation. He raised funds. He negotiated with landowners. He organized a campaign to protect Serpent Mound from destruction. In 1887, the land was purchased and set aside as a protected archaeological site. This made Serpent Mound one of the very first protected archaeological sites in the entire United States. The groundwork for the modern preservation movement was laid, not on the streets of Washington or in the halls of Congress, but here on a ridge above a small creek in southern Ohio, because a scientist and a community understood that some things were worth saving. The act of preservation itself is worthy of wonder. Every person who walked the mound in the 20th century and into the 21st, every school group that visited, every family that stood on the ridge and looked out over the landscape, every archaeologist who studied it, did so because Putnam and his contemporaries decided that this mound mattered, that it would not be ploughed under, that it would not be forgotten. The mound we know today is the mound that Putnam fought to preserve. And what we see today is a living connection to the distant past. You can touch the earth that skillful hands shaped. You can stand where distant feet stood. You can sense the presence of people thousands of years gone, communicating across the centuries through the medium of earth and stone in the shape of a serpent swallowing something that we cannot name. The physical act of walking Serpent Mound today is an act of communion with the past. Your body moves through space that was deliberately shaped by other bodies. Your eyes see patterns that other eyes were meant to see. Your mind encounters a mystery that other minds must have spent years trying to solve. And there is something profound in that encounter. There is something that makes time feel less like a river flowing away and more like a circle, or a spiral, or a serpent coiled back upon itself, endlessly swallowing and regurgitating the same profound questions. Why was it built? Who built it? What did it mean? These questions lead into deeper ones. What were these people trying to accomplish? What did they believe about the world? What made something worth creating on such a massive scale? What were they trying to communicate? And to whom? If it was meant to be seen from above, then they must have believed that there was something or someone above to see it. They must have had cosmological beliefs, spiritual frameworks, ways of understanding the universe that included watchers in the sky. Whether those watchers were gods or stars or abstract concepts given form, we can only guess. But the very fact that they built something meant to be viewed from above suggests a certain sophistication in their understanding of the cosmos. It suggests that they were not simple people engaged in simple pursuits. They were people with big ideas, people with big questions, people with vision. And that vision, encoded in earth and stone, still speaks to us across the centuries, still confuses us, still inspires wonder, still keeps us awake at night trying to solve a mystery that may never be solved, trying to understand a message that may have been lost long before we learned to read. So what do we know, and what can we say with certainty? We know that Serpent Mound exists. We know it is real. We know it has been studied extensively and protected carefully. We know it was built by human hands, worked by human sweat, planned by human intelligence. We know it sits on a ridge above a creek in Adams County, Ohio, and that ridge marks a cosmic scar from space. We know it was important enough to create, important enough to maintain, important enough for Frederick Ward Putnam to fight to preserve. What we do not know is the final answer, the complete solution to the riddle, and perhaps that is the way it should be. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries, to perplex us, to inspire us, to draw us back again and again with the hope that one more time, one more investigation, one more theory might finally unlock the secret. Serpent Mound will not give up its answer easily. It has waited this long, it can wait longer. It will remain on its ridge, coiled and patient, swallowing its oval of unknown significance, speaking its silent message to the sky. In the darkness tonight, as you lie in bed thinking about these things, picture the serpent watching over the valley. Consider the countless nights it has stood there while civilizations rose and fell, while the world changed, while people lived and died and were replaced by others who had never heard its story. Think of the moment it was completed, when the final basket of earth was placed, when the builders stepped back and saw what they had made. What did they feel? Pride? Wonder? Connection to something larger than themselves? Did they understand that their creation would survive longer than their names, longer than their memories, longer than their entire civilization? Did they know that thousands of years later, strangers would still be trying to understand what they meant? The serpent on the ridge above Ohio Brush Creek is waiting for you. It has been waiting for thousands of years. It will wait for thousands more. But here's where things get truly unsettling, where the boundary between accident and intention completely dissolves into something far stranger than anyone initially imagined when they first walked this landscape. The serpent isn't just lying there randomly across the Ohio landscape like some forgotten artifact of whimsy, or the careless byproduct of casual earth movement. Its head points directly at the summer solstice sunset with such precision that modern astronomers and surveyors have verified the alignment repeatedly over decades of careful measurement and systematic observation. The moment when the sun appears to dip below the horizon at the year's turning point, that exact moment when summer reaches its astronomical peak, it aligns perfectly with where that serpent's head gazes steadfastly toward the western sky in an unwavering stare across the centuries. This isn't coincidence, isn't random chance, isn't the accidental byproduct of routine construction or casual landscaping decisions. This is deliberate cosmic navigation etched permanently into 1,000 feet of earth by people who understood the heavens in ways that shouldn't have existed according to conventional historical textbooks and academic understanding. The coils of the serpent's entire undulating body, tracing their sinuous path gracefully across the Ohio landscape, align with something equally specific and equally intentional as the head. Researchers have tracked meticulously how the serpent's curves correspond to the sunrise and sunset points at the equinoxes and solstices throughout the entire calendar year. Picture standing there in what we estimate to be around 1070 AD, or perhaps some generations before that moment, watching your culture's elders complete a monument that actually functions as a working calendar. Consider being one of thousands of people who collectively moved Earth across this hillside to transform the landscape into a calendar written in dirt and stone and precisely aligned with the heavens above. The oval in the serpent's mouth, that peculiar distinctive shape that the builders deliberately placed there with clear intention, some researchers believe it represents the sun being swallowed during an eclipse event. Think about witnessing that catastrophic moment as a person living in such distant times, the sky going dark at noon when it should be bright, the stars suddenly appearing in daytime sky in defiance of natural law, and having to interpret what you're witnessing spiritually, making sense of it as the sun entering the serpent's mouth, being consumed entirely, being taken and devoured by this cosmic serpent represented in Earth. Perhaps the entire structure was built as a massive astronomical observatory, a machine made entirely of earth, designed to track the heavens and predict celestial events with exceptional accuracy across generations. The fort primordial culture had knowledge that most conventional textbooks say shouldn't have existed on this continent, knowledge that challenges everything we assumed about technological development and astronomical understanding in pre-Columbian North America. They understood the sky deeply enough to build monuments that still align perfectly with solar events 1,000 years later, surviving erosion and weather and the unforgiving passage of countless seasons. This wasn't random decoration, wasn't casual ornamentation added simply for aesthetic purposes or visual interest. This was a cosmic thesis written in elevation and direction and curve and the precise mathematics of earth-moving and landscape engineering. Now consider the timing more carefully, with the understanding that the people building this mound would have been keenly aware of celestial events happening directly overhead in their sky. In 1066 AD, Halley's comet blazed across the sky so bright, so visible, so undeniable that medieval monks in Europe recorded it meticulously in their manuscripts and chronicles for posterity. The entire world witnessed it, from distant China to Scandinavia, to here in the Americas where these people were building their monuments and living their lives and observing the sky. The same comet that would later be immortalized in the famous Bayeux Tapestry, showing the Norman conquest of England. That comet was visible here too, burning brightly across the Ohio sky. Then just 12 years later, in 1054 AD, something even more dramatic happened in the heavens above the continent. A star exploded in a way that hadn't been witnessed in recorded human history before that moment. A supernova so brilliant it was visible in broad daylight for 23 consecutive days and nights. A light that couldn't be missed by anyone looking upward. The explosion created what we now call the Crab Nebula, a massive cloud of expanding stellar debris and radiation that scientists have studied extensively with modern telescopes. It was bright enough that you could see it at noon if you knew where to look, bright enough that it would be impossible to miss or ignore, bright enough that it would permanently alter how a culture viewed the cosmos and their place in it. Scientists and historians believe the fort primordial people absolutely saw these cosmic events with their own eyes, that they witnessed them directly, and that these events would have held profound spiritual and practical significance in their worldview. And here's the question that keeps historians and archaeologists awake at night, wondering and searching for answers that may never come fully clear. Did they build the serpent in direct response to these events? Were they creating a cosmic monument to commemorate the moment when the sky seemed to tear itself apart? Did they interpret these celestial catastrophes as omens or messages from the spirits or gods? Perhaps the serpent represents the chaos they witnessed, the cosmic snake swallowing the sun, the heavens becoming unstable and unpredictable. Or perhaps they built it as a way to anchor themselves spiritually during a time when the very sky seemed to be falling, when the universe revealed its volatility and deep mystery. It's the kind of question that has no definitive answer, no archaeological proof that definitively settles the debate conclusively, But asking it changes everything about how you view the mound and its builders. You're no longer looking at a piece of earth shaped by human hands for practical purposes. You're looking at a response to cosmic trauma, a landscape-sized prayer or warning or explanation for celestial violence and mystery. You're looking at a monument built by people trying to make sense of a universe far bigger than themselves. This brings us to something that will fundamentally shift your entire perspective on Native American history and pre-Columbian achievement on this continent and in the Western Hemisphere. The Serpent Mound isn't unique, isn't even the strangest or most elaborate effigy mound built by these cultures across centuries of continuous development and refinement. There are dozens of verified examples, maybe hundreds when you count the ones that have been erased or lost to agriculture and modern development over centuries. Bear mounds clawing at the earth with outstretched limbs frozen in eternal motion. Bird mounds with wings spread impossibly wide as if caught mid-flight reaching toward the sky. Panther mounds, eagle mounds, turtle mounds, dolphin mounds, all designed to be viewed from above as if someone anticipated that humans would eventually learn to fly thousands of years before the Wright brothers made their historic flight. The Marching Bear Mounds in Iowa consist of 10 individual bears in perfect formation, each one the size of a football field, each one deliberate and distinct and separate. The Man Mound in Wisconsin shows a human figure with arms outstretched as if reaching toward something just beyond perception or grasp or understanding. At Effigy Mounds National Monument in Iowa, you can walk along the bluffs and see dozens of these shapes rising from the earth, each one telling a story about the people who built them and their spiritual beliefs. Consider an entire culture that decided to use the landscape itself as canvas and medium, that spent generations moving earth to create pictures and representations that could only be fully appreciated and understood from the sky above. 1,000, 1,500, sometimes 2,000 years before the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk, these people were building images specifically designed for an aerial perspective that no living human could see from ground level. They couldn't possibly see their own work completed from where they stood, couldn't walk the mounds and perceive their full shape and meaning and intention. Yet they built these monuments with the confidence that they would be understood eventually by someone, by future generations with different capabilities and different ways of seeing. Walking along the Serpent Mound itself at ground level, you can't perceive its actual shape from where your feet touch the earth. You see mounds, undulations, rises and falls in the topography, ridges that make sense only when you're directly on the moving forward. But step back, rise higher to a hillside perspective, view it from the sky through aircraft or modern satellite imagery and maps, and suddenly the intention becomes explosively, undeniably clear and obvious. The builders designed this for an audience that wouldn't exist until centuries after they died, perhaps even millennia after their culture faded away into history, unless they believed they could see it from elsewhere, from the spirit realm, from the sky itself, from a perspective that transcended normal human limitations and mortal perception entirely. This speaks to something profound about how these cultures understood their relationship to the earth and the cosmos and to time itself. They weren't building for themselves in the way modern people build for ourselves, creating structures for immediate use and benefit and practical purposes. They were building for something beyond their current understanding, for entities in the sky, for future generations who might achieve flight, for a spiritual geography that transcended normal human perception and understanding of space. And when Europeans arrived and saw these mounds, when they walked among these massive earthworks and contemplated their implications and meaning, they made a terrible decision that would echo through centuries and centuries. They refused to believe Native Americans built them, refused to accept that native peoples possessed the knowledge and capability and organizational power required to create such magnificent monuments. The mounds were too sophisticated, they argued, too perfectly engineered, too clearly the work of people with advanced mathematics and astronomy and engineering knowledge. Therefore, Native Americans couldn't have built them, couldn't possibly have the capability or intelligence or skill. Instead, Europeans invented something called the Mound Builder myth, a historical fiction that explained these monuments while simultaneously erasing Native American achievement and accomplishment. This myth proposed that a lost race of white people, a vanished civilization far superior to the natives, had built everything that Europeans found impressive. These superior builders then either left the continent or were destroyed and wiped out by the savage Native Americans, who took their place and degraded the landscape. This myth became widespread, spreading like disease through the culture and institutions of the new nation being formed. It appeared in newspapers and academic journals and history books and government documents designed to explain and legitimize colonialism and expansion. It spread from the East Coast to the expanding frontier, moving with settlers and soldiers and scholars who promoted it. And crucially, this myth was used deliberately and systematically to justify taking native land and resources and lives. If Native Americans were merely occupying land built by someone else, if they couldn't possibly be sophisticated enough to create such elaborate monuments, then taking that land from them wasn't really theft or injustice. It was reclamation. It was returning the land to its rightful place in civilization. It was justified conquest and expansion. The mound builder myth served colonialism perfectly, served the interests of people who wanted to take land and resources and didn't want to believe they were stealing from advanced civilizations. It elevated native people's accomplishments while simultaneously denying them credit for those accomplishments. It was intellectual theft paired with territorial theft, a double erasure that allowed genocide to proceed with philosophical justification and moral cover. And here's what makes this historical crime even worse. The evidence was always clear and obvious and present, always available to anyone looking, always contradicting the myth with facts. The mounds contained ancient Native American bones and artifacts and burial goods identical to those found in confirmed Native American settlements elsewhere on the continent. The construction techniques matched other verified Native American engineering and building practices throughout different regions. Linguistic evidence linked the mounds to specific native nations and language families and cultural groups. Genetic analysis confirmed Native American origins of these mound builder cultures in times long past. But these facts were ignored and suppressed and explained away because they conflicted with the racist narrative that served colonialism. The truth is that Native Americans built every single one of these mounds without exception or doubt. The Adena, the Hopewell, the Fort Historic, the Mississippian cultures all created elaborate earthwork networks spanning thousands of miles across the continent. They built mounds for burials and ceremonies, and astronomical observation and defense and storage. They created roads and plazas and gathering spaces and ceremonial grounds. Some mound complexes took generations to complete, requiring coordination of hundreds or thousands of workers, carefully planning and executing massive construction projects. The Serpent Mound is most likely attributed to the Fort Primordial culture, based on current archaeological evidence, though some evidence suggests the Adena people might have built it, or a precursor. Either way, it was Native American hands and intelligence and planning that shaped this earth and created this monument. And yet the mound builder myth persisted for over a century, despite overwhelming contradicting evidence and facts. It wasn't definitively disproven in academic circles until the late 1800s and early 1900s, decades after it should have been abandoned. It lingered in popular culture and textbooks even longer, influencing generations of American understanding and identity. The damage it caused was incalculable, and continues to reverberate through American consciousness and institutions today. It delegitimized Native American history and accomplishments, erased genuine achievements from the historical record, provided intellectual cover for genocide and land theft and cultural destruction, and created false narratives about who built America and who deserves rights to this land. Standing at the Serpent Mound today, understanding its astronomical alignments and engineering precision and cultural significance, you're looking at evidence of that erasure and theft of history. You're looking at a monument that European settlers couldn't imagine Native Americans creating, so they created an entire false history to explain it away and deny Native people credit. And the Serpent Mound isn't even the oldest astronomical or ceremonial structure in Ohio. Before the Fort Primordial, people built the Serpent. Before the Mississippian culture dominated the continent and created massive cities like Cahokia, there were the Adena people. And what the Adena built will completely change how you think about this entire continental history. The Adena culture flourished from about 1000 BC to around 100 AD, centuries before the Fort Primordial people would walk this same land and build their serpent. They came before, and they left behind evidence that still confuses and astounds archaeologists today, with its sophistication and precision. They built mounds with purposes we're still trying to understand and decode after millennia. They created geometric earthworks and astronomical alignments that suggest they possessed knowledge of the heavens that rivaled or exceeded what we thought possible for peoples without written language or metal tools or wheels. Consider what we know about the Adena people from decades of archaeological study and excavation. They were not simple hunter-gatherers moving constantly seeking food and shelter from place to place. They were settled communities with permanent structures, agricultural people who understood soil and seasons and cultivation and crop rotation. They built permanent villages and ceremonial centres designed with purpose and planning. They had trade networks that stretched hundreds of miles connecting them to distant peoples and resources. They created elaborate burial mounds where they interred their dead with precious goods that took time and resources to acquire and craft with care. They made jewellery and tools and weapons of remarkable quality. They gathered and used plants medicinally. They understood their environment with deep knowledge. The most significant thing about the Adena culture is that they seem to value knowledge and observation above almost everything else in their society. They built their ceremonial sites with astronomical purpose encoded in the very ground. They oriented their mounds and structures to align with celestial events and heavenly bodies. They spent resources and labour and time on projects that had no practical economic benefit for survival, which suggests these projects held spiritual and intellectual significance of the highest order. Some Adena mounds align with equinoxes, with solstices, with the rising and setting of major stars like Polaris and other constellations. Some mound complexes include elaborate geometric patterns that can only be fully appreciated from the air high above the Earth. Some researchers believe the Adena developed a sophisticated understanding of mathematics and geometry based on the precision of their earthworks and the accuracy of their alignments. The distances they maintained, the angles they created, the curves they carved, all suggest mathematical knowledge that shouldn't exist according to traditional historical narrative. This brings us to a crucial realization that fundamentally challenges how we understand human history and development. If the Adena were building such sophisticated structures 2,000 years before European contact, what does that say about Native American capability and knowledge? What does it say about civilization and development and progress itself? We tend to think of civilization as something that developed in certain specific parts of the world and then gradually spread outward to other regions. We think of Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, the Indus Valley as the places where civilization supposedly emerged and developed. We often exclude the Americas from those conversations, treating Native American societies as less developed, less sophisticated, less advanced than their Old World counterparts. But standing in front of Adena earthworks, understanding what they built and how they built it without metal tools, that entire narrative falls apart entirely. The Adena were building sophisticated ceremonial and ancient astronomical structures, while Rome was still expanding across Europe and the Mediterranean. They were creating geometric monuments with mathematical precision, while Chinese dynasties rose and fell across centuries. They were demonstrating engineering knowledge, while European societies struggled through the Dark Ages, and their works lasted, survived, stood the test of 2,000 years of weather and erosion and catastrophe and neglect. Many Adena mounds still stand today in their original condition, still maintain their shapes and alignments with celestial bodies, still tell us about a people who cared deeply about precision and meaning and knowledge. Think about what that means for your understanding of history and human capability and progress. The conventional narrative in American textbooks is that Native Americans were standing still culturally, while Europeans developed civilization and technology. It's a myth as false and as damaging as the mound builder myth itself, equally destructive to understanding. Native Americans were not standing still. They were building continuously. They were observing the sky with intention. They were creating with purpose. They were developing increasingly sophisticated understanding of mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, and complex social organization. The Mississippian culture that came after the Adena built the city of Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis in what's now Illinois. At its peak around 1100 AD, Cahokia had a population of about 20,000 people, living in the city proper. It was larger and more sophisticated than London at that same time period in medieval Europe. It had markets and neighbourhoods and public plazas and monumental architecture, including Monk's Mound, the largest earthwork structure north of Mesoamerica. It had a sophisticated governmental system, with clear hierarchical organisation and extensive trade networks that stretched across the entire continent, connecting distant peoples and resources. Residents of Cahokia traded with people in the Great Lakes region, the upper Mississippi River Valley, the Gulf Coast, and the Atlantic seaboard. They imported materials like copper from the Great Lakes and marine shells from the Gulf. They created sophisticated pottery and metalwork. They had a coordinated agricultural system supporting the population. It fell into decline by the time of European contact, probably due to environmental stress and climate change around 1300 AD. But when Europeans arrived centuries later, they had no real context for what they were seeing when they encountered the remains of Mississippian civilization and the mounds it had built. Modern excavations at Cahokia reveal the complexity of the city. Archaeologists have found evidence of palisades and walls, evidence of carefully planned neighborhoods, evidence of public buildings and ceremonial structures. They've found astronomical alignments suggesting the culture tracked celestial events as carefully as the Adena did. Woodhenge, as it's been called, was a solar calendar made of wooden posts that marked important points in the solar year. This kind of knowledge and sophistication challenges every assumption European settlers had about Native American peoples. Picture walking through a landscape filled with massive mounds and earthworks and clear evidence of sophisticated engineering and complex organization, and then insisting that the people who lived there couldn't possibly have built these things, because they looked different than you expected or didn't fit your ideas of civilization. Consider inventing elaborate myths about lost white races, rather than acknowledging the accomplishments of the people who actually built them with their own hands and intelligence. That's exactly what Europeans did consistently across the continent, from Ohio to Mississippi to the Great Lakes. And that false narrative shaped American understanding of this entire continent and its peoples for centuries afterward in profound ways. It shaped policies that led directly to land theft and genocide and cultural destruction. It shaped textbooks that taught generations of American children that native peoples were primitive and uncivilized and inferior and incapable. It shaped attitudes that persist today in subtle and not-so-subtle ways in how we teach history and understand progress. The Serpent Mound and all the other mounds represent something else entirely. They represent a different path of human development, a different way of organizing society and knowledge. They represent a sophisticated understanding of the heavens and the earth. They represent people who valued precision and meaning and knowledge enough to spend generations building monuments that would last thousands of years. Understanding the truth about the Serpent Mound, understanding it as a fort primordial achievement aligned precisely with the stars and the seasons, understanding it in the context of Adena earthworks that preceded it by centuries, and Mississippian cities and civilizations that followed, requires rejecting these damaging false narratives completely and permanently. It requires seeing Native American peoples as truly sophisticated, intelligent, capable builders and thinkers and observers of the cosmos. It requires understanding that the Americas had developed complex civilizations independently across thousands of years, that they had their own unique trajectories and tremendous achievements. It requires respecting the knowledge and accomplishment of the people who built these monuments and created these societies and systems. It requires understanding that Native American peoples had writing systems and calendars and astronomical knowledge. It requires recognizing that the collapse of these civilizations wasn't inevitable or evidence of inferiority, but rather the result of specific historical circumstances including climate change and disease. Standing here, understanding the Serpent Mound in its full context, you're standing at the intersection of astronomy and archaeology and indigenous knowledge systems. You're standing in front of evidence that challenges everything you thought you knew about history. And as we've emphasized, the Serpent Mound isn't even the oldest significant structure in Ohio. It isn't the most sophisticated, and it isn't even the most important. What the Adena built before it, what they left behind in the form of ancient mounds and earthworks and astronomical alignments, what they achieved centuries before the Fort Primordial people built the Serpent, will change fundamentally how you think about this entire continent and the depth of civilization and knowledge that existed here long before Columbus or any European ever sailed across an ocean. And the Serpent Mound isn't even the oldest structure in Ohio. What the Adena built before it will change how you think about this entire continent. To understand the Serpent Mound, you need to understand who built it, and that means travelling back to a time before pyramids, before Rome, before anything you might call civilization existed in North America. Around 800 BC, in the Ohio Valley and surrounding regions, a culture emerged that would change everything. They were the Adena people, and they left behind monuments that still baffle us today. The Adena weren't simply hunter-gatherers with a few ceremonial sites. They were organized, intentional, and driven by something we still don't fully understand. They built the first mounds in North America, monumental structures that required planning, coordination, and years of sustained effort. When you say mounds, most people think of random hills or piles of earth scattered across the landscape. But the Adena mounds were fundamentally different from natural formations. They were purposeful, geometric, and designed specifically to house the dead in elaborate underground tombs. The most famous Adena mound surviving today is the Grave Creek Mound in West Virginia, which still stands at an impressive 69 feet tall. Imagine looking up at a 7-story building made entirely of earth. That's the height we're talking about. This enormous mound was constructed by hand, one basket of dirt at a time, requiring the labour of countless people working across many seasons. To give you a sense of scale, archaeologists estimate that the Grave Creek Mound contains approximately 57 million cubic feet of earth. That's enough material to fill a modern shopping centre. Constructing such a massive mound would have required planning and organisation at a societal level we typically don't associate with pre-Columbian North America. To build something this large, you'd need to mobilise workers, coordinate their labour, organise supply lines to feed them, and maintain the effort across years. The Adena clearly had the social structure and organisational capability to accomplish these enormous tasks. Inside the Grave Creek Mound and similar structures, archaeologists found something that changed how we think about these ancient people. The dead were placed in carefully constructed burial chambers. These weren't simple graves dug in the ground. They were elaborate tombs built from wood and stone, sealed and protected inside the massive earthen mounds. The bodies were placed with reverence and care, surrounded by grave goods that tell us something profound about Adena beliefs and values. They buried their dead with copper ornaments, objects crafted with incredible skill, from raw copper that had to be obtained from Lake Superior and other distant sources. These weren't crude metal objects hammered by inexperienced hands. They were finely worked pieces, some shaped into animal forms, others into geometric patterns of impressive complexity. Copper ear spools, breastplates, bracelets, and other ornamental items have been found in Adena burials throughout the Ohio Valley. The craftsmanship suggests that the Adena had metallurgical knowledge and the ability to work copper into complex shapes using stone and bone tools. They understood annealing, the process of heating and cooling copper to make it workable. They placed mica sheets in graves, sheets so thin and uniform they had to be carefully split and prepared over many hours of painstaking labour. Mica is a mineral that comes from the Appalachian Mountains in the east, hundreds of miles from the burial mounds. The Adena obtained it, transported it across difficult terrain, and then spent enormous amounts of time processing it into usable sheets, thin enough to be folded or layered. They included shells from the Gulf of Mexico in burials, shells that came from thousands of miles away. Let's be absolutely clear about what this means. Gulf shells cannot be found naturally in Ohio or the surrounding regions. They didn't drift northward on rivers. They didn't wash up on beaches or appear through any natural process whatsoever. They were carried to Ohio by human hands, transported across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain, through forests and mountains and river valleys. This tells us that the Adena had established trade networks spanning more than 1,000 miles. They had contacts and relationships with people in distant lands. They had systems for exchanging goods and moving materials across an entire continent. The trade wasn't unidirectional. The Adena didn't simply import foreign materials, they exported goods as well. Adena-style artifacts, pottery and tools have been found in distant regions, suggesting that Adena goods travelled back out through the network. This was reciprocal trade, a genuine exchange between peoples who valued what each other produced. Items like polished stone tools, distinctive pottery, and carved ornaments travelled from the Ohio Valley outward, reaching peoples in the southeast, the upper Mississippi River Valley and other regions. The existence of these trade networks this early in North American prehistory is striking. These networks wouldn't develop again in North America until the later Mississippian culture, over 1,000 years later. The Grave Creek Mound itself has yielded another notable artifact, a slate tablet covered with mysterious inscriptions. These inscriptions might be writing, though they remain undeciphered by modern scholars. Scholars debate whether they're evidence of an Adena writing system or simply decorative patterns. But the fact that someone took the time to carve detailed marks onto a slate tablet and place it in a burial mound suggests a level of cultural development and symbolic thinking that challenges old stereotypes about pre-Columbian peoples. The Adena people themselves were impressive in physical stature. When archaeologists excavated and examined skeletal remains from Adena burial mounds, they discovered something notable that surprised the scientific community. The men were tall, many standing over 6 feet in height. In an era when the average human height was significantly lower than today, individuals over 6 feet would have been impressive and noteworthy. Some researchers have speculated that the Adena elite were particularly well fed due to their higher status and access to the best food sources, which might have contributed to their greater height. Others have wondered if they came from a different genetic background than surrounding populations, or if selective breeding occurred. The truth is, we don't fully know the explanation. What we do know is that the Adena had the resources to build enormous mounds and maintain continental trade networks that stretched across North America. This suggests an organised society with enough surplus resources to support specialised craftspeople, traders, shamans, and other non-farming individuals. The Adena culture flourished for roughly 900 years, from around 800 BC until approximately 100 AD. For nearly a millennium, they built mounds, crafted ornaments, traded with distant peoples, and maintained a distinctive way of life centered on ritual, ceremony, and connection to the land. And then something changed. Around 100 AD, a new culture emerged in the same region, building on and expanding the traditions established by their predecessors. We don't know what they called themselves in their own language. We've given them a name based on archaeological convention. We call them the Hopewell culture, named after the Hopewell farm in Ohio, where their sites were first systematically excavated by archaeologists in the late 1800s. But the Hopewell didn't replace the Adena overnight in some violent conquest or catastrophic event. Instead, they inherited the tradition. They took what the Adena had started and they expanded it dramatically. They went bigger, more ambitious, more sophisticated in every way. They took the mound-building tradition and transformed it into something unprecedented in human history. While the Adena were building burial mounds and establishing trade networks, the Hopewell were engineering entire landscapes. They didn't just move Earth to bury the dead, they moved Earth to create geometric patterns on a scale so vast that you cannot fully appreciate them from ground level. The most staggering example is the Newark Earthworks in central Ohio. Picture this scene in your mind as vividly as possible. It's 2,000 years ago, and you're standing in what is now central Ohio. All around you, massive earthen walls rise from the ground in perfect geometric shapes. There are enormous circles so large that a modern football stadium with a surrounding track would easily fit inside one. There are perfect octagons, 8-sided figures with sides stretching hundreds of feet each. There are parallel walls creating processional pathways that seem to lead from one geometric shape to another. The entire complex covers 4 square miles of landscape. That's roughly the size of a medium-sized town sprawling across the countryside. To put this in perspective, the entire ancient city of Rome at the time of Christ covered only about 7 square miles. The Newark Earthworks alone cover 4 square miles, without any residential areas, without any shops or markets, just pure ceremonial or observational space. Making this even more noteworthy is that the Newark Earthworks isn't a single monument. It's a connected series of several geometric enclosures, all built according to sophisticated planning and all interconnected through pathways and alignments. This isn't a few scattered mounds like the Adena built. This is a completely engineered landscape, a blank canvas transformed into a work of art and function on a monumental scale. The Hopewell built this network of enclosures with stunning geometric precision that would impress a modern engineer. The walls were constructed from packed earth, sometimes faced or reinforced with stone, and they were laid out according to mathematical principles that suggest advanced knowledge of geometry and measurement. Some walls are perfectly straight for hundreds of feet, defying the natural contours of the land, and were built without any modern surveying equipment. Some circles are so perfectly round that when archaeologists measure them today, they find almost no deviation from a true circle. The largest circle at Newark has a diameter of over 1,000 feet, making it larger than many modern sports facilities. The construction must have required teams of workers operating in coordinated shifts, with someone carefully planning the overall dimensions and layout before construction began. For centuries, archaeologists looked at the Newark Earthworks and interpreted them as ceremonial spaces or gathering places where the Hopewell congregated for rituals and festivals. Others suggested they might be fortifications, defensive structures built to protect the Hopewell settlements from attack. But in recent decades, researchers made a discovery that fundamentally changed how we understand these sites. The geometry wasn't arbitrary or random. The geometry encoded in these earthworks is astronomical in nature. The Newark earthworks encode the 18.6-year lunar cycle with stunning accuracy. This is the astronomical cycle that governs the rising and setting positions of the moon on the horizon throughout a long-term pattern. The moon rises and sets at a slightly different position each night, and over a cycle of about 18.6 years, it reaches its maximum northern and southern points on the horizon before the cycle repeats itself. This lunar cycle is related to the precession of the plane of the moon's orbit, and understanding it requires careful observation and detailed astronomical knowledge accumulated over many years. By carefully measuring the alignments of the walls, circles, and octagons at Newark, researchers found that the Hopewell oriented these structures to align precisely with the rising and setting positions of the moon at the extremes of its 18.6-year cycle. The main octagon at Newark, for instance, aligns with the lunar standstill, the point where the moon's rising and setting positions reach their maximum northern and southern excursions. Other features align with the summer and winter solstices, the points where the sun reaches its maximum northern and southern positions. This wasn't decoration or symbolic representation that happened to align with astronomical events. This was a functional, working astronomical observatory built 2,000 years ago in Ohio. It's as sophisticated as Stonehenge in England, and it was engineered by a culture we knew almost nothing about until recent research. The implications of this discovery are staggering to contemplate. To build a structure that accurately encodes an 18.6-year lunar cycle, the Hopewell had to observe the moon continuously over many years. They probably needed to observe it for at least 1 or 2 complete cycles to be certain of their measurements. That means generations of Hopewell priests or astronomers were recording lunar positions with incredible accuracy, sharing that knowledge and passing it down faithfully to younger generations. They had to train people in these calculations and observations, creating a specialized class of astronomical experts. They had to coordinate the labor and resources needed to construct massive geometric earthworks that stretched across 4 square miles. This wasn't a simple achievement accomplished in a few years by a small group of workers. This was a civilization-level accomplishment requiring sustained effort over centuries, with knowledge preserved and passed down generation after generation. The Hopewell culture flourished from roughly 100 BC to 500 AD, spanning about 600 years of impressive achievement. During that time, they maintained and expanded this astronomical knowledge across a vast region. Hopewell sites have been found from the Great Lakes region in the north to the Gulf Coast in the south, from the Atlantic coastal areas in the east to as far west as the Rocky Mountains. The Hopewell influence spread across at least half of North America, from the Mississippi River to the Atlantic, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf. But Hopewell culture wasn't defined by conquest or political unification under a single ruler. It wasn't spread by armies or forceful subjugation. Instead, it was defined by a shared tradition of mound building, ceremonial practices, and most notably trade. The Hopewell exchange system was unlike anything that existed anywhere else in the world at that time. It was a continental network of trade and cultural exchange operating at a scale not seen again in North America until after European contact. Merchants and traders moved goods across an enormous territory. We know this happened because archaeologists have traced the origins of materials found in Hopewell mounds through geological and chemical analysis. Obsidian appears in Hopewell sites throughout the Midwest, but obsidian comes from Yellowstone in modern-day Wyoming. That's 1,500 miles away from the Midwest. Copper appears in Hopewell ornaments, and the copper comes from the Lake Superior region in the north. Shells appear in Hopewell burials, and they come from the Gulf of Mexico, thousands of miles to the south. Mica comes from the Appalachian Mountains in the east. Shark teeth from the Atlantic coast appear in Hopewell sites in the Midwest. Grizzly bear teeth from grizzly bears that only lived in the Rocky Mountains thousands of miles to the west appear in burials in Ohio and other Midwest locations. All of these materials end up together in the same burial mounds, sometimes in the same graves with the same individuals. This wasn't casual or coincidental trade. This was a sophisticated network where goods moved thousands of miles from their point of origin to their final resting place. The Hopewell obtained raw materials from across the continent, crafted them into ornaments and trade goods, and then distributed them back out through the network. A shell from the Gulf might be carved into an ornament in Ohio and buried in a mound in Michigan. A piece of obsidian from Yellowstone might travel to the Midwest where it was worked into a tool or ornament and then traded east. The trade wasn't in raw materials alone. Knowledge moved through this exchange system too. Ideas, religious practices, artistic styles all flowed through the Hopewell network with impressive consistency. Sites across a vast region show similar pottery styles, similar effigy mounds, and similar ritual practices. This shared culture wasn't imposed from above by a central authority. It was voluntary participation in a cultural system that transcended political boundaries. The Hopewell exchange system was distinctive for another important reason. It wasn't based on conquest or coercion. Unlike later empires that dominated through military force, there's no evidence of Hopewell military conquest or forced tribute. There are no fortified settlements, no evidence of siege warfare, no bones showing violent death from organised conflict. Instead, the Hopewell organised themselves through ceremony, ritual, and shared cultural practices. Trade must have been accompanied by festivals and ceremonies on a grand scale. Imagine groups from different regions gathering at the great earthwork centres like Newark. Hundreds or thousands of people would journey to these sites, travelling sometimes hundreds of miles to attend. They would exchange goods, yes, but they'd also exchange gifts, forge alliances, conduct rituals, and celebrate their shared identity as members of the Hopewell world. The monumental earthworks themselves might have served as gathering places for these great ceremonies where thousands of people congregated. The acoustic properties of some sites might have been important, allowing sound to carry across the enclosed spaces. Leaders would have spoken or sung, and their voices would have echoed off the earthen walls. What we see in the archaeology is evidence of a civilization that valued connection and exchange over domination and warfare. Daily life for a typical Hopewell person was more sophisticated than popular depictions suggest. They lived in villages of circular houses, structures built with wooden frames and covered with bark or thatch. These villages clustered around the major earthwork sites, suggesting that the monuments were central to Hopewell community life and cultural identity. The Hopewell developed sophisticated pottery. Their ceramics were decorated with geometric patterns, sometimes geometric designs of striking complexity and technical skill that required careful planning before execution. Other pots were marked with cordwood impressions created by pressing cords or fibre bundles into soft clay before firing, creating complex textures and patterns. Some pots were large enough to store or cook food for entire families or communities, with capacities of several gallons. Others were small enough to fit in your hand, perhaps used for individual portions or ceremonial purposes. These vessels served practical purposes for daily cooking and storage, but they also displayed genuine artistic skill and aesthetic sensibility. The decorative patterns weren't random or haphazard. They were carefully planned geometric designs that suggest mathematical knowledge and artistic planning. The Hopewell created elaborate art. Copper ear spools, ornamental objects meant to be worn stretched in pierced ears, were crafted with considerable skill and artistry. They worked raw copper into intricate shapes, sometimes depicting birds or other animals. The copper was cold-hammered and annealed, heated and cooled in cycles to make it workable. Clay figurines of humans and animals appeared in some sites. Some figurines are tiny, abstract representations, others are detailed and lifelike with striking naturalism. These weren't toys for children. They served ceremonial or religious purposes. They might have been fertility figurines, representations of important ancestors, or objects used in rituals. Among the most striking Hopewell artifacts are the carved pipes, often called effigy pipes by archaeologists. These weren't simple tools for smoking tobacco. They were elaborate sculptures that served ritual purposes. The bowl of the pipe was carved in the shape of an animal. You might find a bird, its wings spread wide, the bowl of the pipe carved along its back. You might find a frog, its mouth opened in a permanent expression. You might find a bear, a fish, a turtle, or other animals. Each pipe was a unique work of art and a functional object combined. The carving required considerable skill and patience. The artist had to plan the piece carefully, considering how the final form would look while maintaining functionality. Then, using only stone tools, the artist had to carve the piece from stone, gradually shaping the animal form with precise, careful strokes. Some pipes are remarkably detailed, with individual feathers carved on bird pipes or teeth carved into animal pipes. The eyes of the creatures are sometimes represented by shell inlays. The base of each pipe often shows sophisticated design. These objects tell us something important. The Hopewell weren't primitive or unsophisticated in any meaningful sense. They were artists, engineers, astronomers, and traders. They had time for art because they had organised their society efficiently enough to produce surplus resources. They invested in monumental architecture and elaborate ceremonies because these things held deep meaning for their culture. The Hopewell built because they needed to express something, to communicate with their gods or spirits, to mark important events, to honour their dead. But the mound builders weren't just building tombs and trade routes. They were building something far more ambitious. And it took 1,500 years to finish. The Hopewell culture gradually declined after around 500 AD, but the tradition they established persisted. Later cultures would inherit and modify the mound-building practices. The Fort Ancient culture, the Mississippian culture, and many others continued the practice of constructing earthworks and burying their dead in mounds. Some scholars believe that the memory of the great mound builders remained part of oral tradition among later peoples, passed down through countless generations in stories and legends. By the time Europeans arrived in North America, most of the great earthworks had fallen into disrepair. The Serpent Mound itself was largely covered with forest and overgrown vegetation. The Newark earthworks were partially destroyed as settlers cleared land for farming and construction. Many smaller mounds were flattened entirely. For centuries, Europeans and later Americans didn't even realize what they were looking at. They thought the mounds were natural hills, or the work of mysterious lost civilizations from across the ocean. They couldn't conceive that indigenous peoples, whom they viewed as primitive and uncivilized, could have built such sophisticated monuments. The mounds challenged everything they believed about Native Americans. It took archaeologists decades to prove that the mound builders were indeed the ancestors of the indigenous peoples living in North America when Europeans arrived. The evidence came from multiple sources. Skeletal analysis showed genetic continuity. Artifact styles showed clear progression, from Adena to Hopewell to later cultures. Carbon dating proved that the mounds were built by people who had lived in North America for thousands of years. Some of the mounds contain burials of hundreds or even thousands of people, suggesting that entire communities gathered for funeral ceremonies. The scale and complexity of the mounds proved that North America had supported sophisticated civilizations with complex social organization, specialized labor, astronomical knowledge, and continental trade networks. This challenged the entire European narrative about the New World being empty and waiting for civilization. The truth was more complicated. North America had civilizations. They looked different from European civilizations. They didn't have written language in the same way, though they may have had systems of symbolic notation. They didn't have the same kind of political organization. They didn't build permanent cities in the European sense. But they built monumental architecture, maintained trade networks, developed sophisticated art and crafts, and possessed astronomical knowledge. The mounds were monuments to a different way of organizing human society, a way focused on ritual, ceremony, connection to the land, and peaceful exchange rather than conquest and domination. For visitors today, standing at the Newark earthworks and looking out across the geometric enclosures is a humbling experience that connects you directly to the distant past. You're standing in a landscape that was deliberately engineered thousands of years ago with precision that would astound a modern engineer. You're surrounded by the evidence of ambition, knowledge, and cultural continuity spanning centuries. You can walk the historic pathways, following routes that Hopewell people walked 2,000 years ago. You can stand in the centres of perfect circles and envision the ceremonies that took place there, the fires burning, the chanting, the gathering of peoples from across the continent. You can feel the weight of human effort and intentionality, the determination of a civilization to leave its mark on the landscape, to build something that would last for millennia. The Hopewell wanted to create something permanent, something that would speak to future generations about who they were and what they believed. In that goal, they succeeded beyond measure. Their earthworks survive today, and they inspire awe. The Serpent Mound itself may have been built by later cultures, but it follows the tradition established by the Adena and Hopewell, the tradition of using earth to create monuments of spiritual and cultural significance. 800 years ago, a city rose in the American heartland that would rival the great capitals of Europe in size and sophistication, and at its centre stood a mound so massive that its footprint dwarfed even the Great Pyramid of Giza, and this city would come to dominate the entire Mississippi Valley, with a network of satellite settlements and trade routes that stretched across an entire continent, and this civilization was called Mississippian, and it represented the spiritual successor to the Hopewell culture that had dominated these lands 1,000 years before, and where Hopewell had built geometric earthworks and practiced subtle astronomy. Mississippian would build colossal monuments that spoke not of subtlety, but of absolute power and religious authority and dominance over the landscape and the people, and this civilization's greatest city was Cahokia, located near what is now St. Louis in southwestern Illinois, and at its peak around the year 1100 AD, Cahokia was home to more than 20,000 people, making it larger than London at that same moment in history, and larger than Paris or any other European city at that time, and these people had developed a complex urban society with distinct neighbourhoods, and specialised craftspeople, and a rigid social hierarchy that suggested a powerful ruling class with absolute control over vast resources and the labour of thousands of workers, and the evidence of this hierarchy is written into the landscape itself in the form of monumental architecture and carefully planned streets and neighbourhoods. And the symbol of Cahokia's dominance was a structure called Monk's Mound, named centuries later by French Trappist monks who would establish a monastery near its base, and this earthen mound rose 100 feet into the air with a footprint of 14 acres, and to put this in perspective, the Great Pyramid of Giza has a footprint of only 13 acres, meaning Monk's Mound actually covers more ground than one of the world's most famous monuments, and yet most Americans have never heard of it, and most history books fail to mention it, and it was built entirely by hand with baskets of soil carried by thousands of workers over generations, and the construction would have required 100 million baskets of earth moved and stacked with incredible precision. And the Cahokia people accomplished this feat using nothing but stone tools and human determination and unwavering social organisation. And archaeologists have calculated that the construction would have taken roughly 200 years, meaning that the monument stood as a multi-generational project that no single person could ever see completed from start to finish, and the workers who started the mound would never live to see it finished, and yet they continued the labour faithfully, and they passed the work on to their children and their grandchildren, and this speaks to an extraordinary level of social organisation and faith in the project, and shared cultural purpose. And around this massive mound, the city sprawled outward in a careful geometric pattern, with neighbourhoods arranged in precise squares and plazas that suggest advanced town planning and careful urban design, and the most impressive of these was the Grand Plaza, which stretched across an area equivalent to 35 football fields placed end to end, and this vast plaza was perfectly level, suggesting that the Cahokia people had the engineering knowledge to grade land on a massive scale, and to create a level surface across several acres would have required careful surveying techniques and enormous effort and mathematical precision. And consider the effort required to create such a level space without modern surveying tools or machinery, and it would have required tens of thousands of hours of labour and careful coordination of hundreds of workers. And in the centre of this plaza stood a remarkable structure made entirely of wood, a calendar device now called the wood henge, consisting of wooden poles arranged in a perfect circle that tracked the movements of the sun throughout the year, and the poles were spaced at precise intervals and aligned with the cardinal directions. And on the solstices and equinoxes, the sun would rise and set through specific gaps in the wooden posts, allowing the Cahokia astronomers to mark the turning of the year with precision, and this suggests a sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics that matched or exceeded the astronomical knowledge of contemporary civilizations in Europe and Asia, and the fact that such a calendar was built demonstrates that astronomical observation was not a casual hobby, but a central concern of Cahokian society and religious practice, and perhaps the ruling class used this astronomical knowledge to control the agricultural calendar, and thereby maintain their authority over the common people. And the ability to predict the solstice or the equinox would have seemed magical to the uneducated masses, and this would have reinforced the power of the priestly class and the authority of the ruling elite. And astronomy was so important to these cultures that they may have built their sacred structures to align with celestial events, and Monk's Mound may itself have served as an astronomical marker, and archaeology has revealed that the Cahokia people maintained trade networks that reached across the entire continent, from the Atlantic coast to the Rocky Mountains and from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, and they traded in copper and shells and exotic stones, and they imported materials from the Great Lakes and from the Rocky Mountains and from distant sources, and they exported finished goods to distant regions. And copperworking was a particularly important craft. And Cahokian artisans created elaborate copper ornaments and religious objects that were traded to distant peoples, and perhaps most strikingly, evidence suggests that chocolate made from cacao beans imported from Mesoamerica was being consumed in Cahokia, and fragments of cacao residue have been found in pottery vessels, meaning the elite of this Mississippi Valley civilization were drinking a luxury beverage that they had sourced through a continental supply chain that stretched more than 1,000 miles, and they were engaging in trade with peoples in what is now Mexico and Central America, and they were part of a truly Pan-American commercial network and cultural exchange system. And this speaks to a level of cultural contact and trade that most Americans do not realize was happening in pre-colonial North America, and the idea that a city in Illinois was importing chocolate from Central America 500 years before Columbus speaks to the sophistication of these continental trade networks. And it also suggests that ideas and spiritual concepts travelled along these same routes, and knowledge of the great civilizations to the south would have been known to the elite of Cahokia, and perhaps they would have seen parallels between their mounds and the pyramids of Mesoamerica, and perhaps they would have incorporated some of these cosmological ideas into their own religious practices. And here is where the deep history of Ohio becomes truly profound, because the Serpent Mound was not built in isolation, and it was not a sudden inspiration of a people with no prior connection to monumental earthworks, and instead, it was the continuation of a tradition that had lasted for 2,000 years or more, a tradition that began with the Adena people around 500 BC, and perhaps even earlier, and continued through the Hopewell culture from about 100 to 500 AD, and reached its ultimate expression in the Mississippian civilization that would dominate from 800 to 1400 AD, and this was a continuous, unbroken lineage of peoples who shared certain fundamental beliefs and practices, and central to all of these cultures was the building of mounds, and the observation of the stars, and the practice of long-distance trade, and the spiritual reverence for the natural world, and particularly for animals and plants that held symbolic meaning. And the Serpent Mound sits at the absolute centre of this timeline, and it represents either the culmination of the Adena tradition, or the earliest expression of the Hopewell tradition, or possibly a transitional monument built during the period when one culture was transforming into the next. And scholars debate the exact dating, and some argue it was built around 1100 BC by the Adena, and others suggest it was built by the Hopewell sometime between 100 and 500 AD, and still others propose a later date closer to the Mississippian period around 1200 AD. And the truth is that the radiocarbon evidence is ambiguous, and the dating remains uncertain, and the serpent itself was a powerful symbol throughout all these cultures, a creature that appeared in the artwork and the mythology and the spiritual practices of these peoples, and the serpent was associated with water and with the underworld and with fertility and with transformation and with hidden power, and it was sometimes depicted as a horned serpent, a creature that combined the power of the serpent with the supernatural authority of horns, and this horned serpent would continue to appear in the mythology of cultures that came much later, and it appears explicitly in Cherokee traditions as a creature called the octagons, and the octagons is described as a monster of incredible power, a great horned serpent that lives in deep water and that is simultaneously feared and respected. And the Cherokee legends speak of warriors who hunted the octagons, and of its power to kill with a glance, and of the magical properties of its body that could cure diseases or grant visions to those brave enough to seek them. And yet the octagons is not purely evil, and it appears in stories as a complex creature with abilities and knowledge that even the most powerful humans cannot match, and it is a creature of ambiguity and mystery. And the octagons appears in stories as a being that must be approached with both respect and fear, and in many Native American traditions, there was a cosmic battle between two powerful forces, and on one side was the underwater panther or underwater serpent, a creature of the water and the underworld, and on the other side was the thunderbird, a creature of the sky and the storm, and these two forces were locked in eternal struggle, and the serpent represented the waters and the depths and the mysteries below, and the thunderbird represented the skies and the lightning and the power from above, and this cosmological duality appears in cultures from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, and from the Atlantic to the Rocky Mountains. And this serpent mythology is not unique to the Cherokee, and it appears across cultures throughout the Americas, and there is evidence of serpent symbolism in the artwork of the Adena and Hopewell peoples, and serpent effigies and serpent imagery appear in pipes and pottery and embossed copper, and there is clear evidence in the Mississippian civilization, and in Mesoamerican cultures there was Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, a deity of wind and learning and creation, and in some traditions the feathered serpent appears as a culture hero who brought knowledge to humanity, and in other traditions Quetzalcoatl was a warrior god who led his people to new lands, and the feathered serpent combining the earthly reptile with the divine bird seems to represent a union of opposites, and a bridging of the earthly and the spiritual realms, and the serpent as a symbol of transformation and mystery and danger appears to have been a fundamental concept across hundreds of different Native American cultures and across multiple continents and multiple centuries, and this suggests something profound about how indigenous peoples of the Americas understood their relationship to the natural world and to the forces of nature that surrounded them, and serpents are creatures that shed their skin, and therefore they are natural symbols of transformation and renewal, and they live both in water and on land, and therefore they bridge multiple realms of existence, and they move silently and strike suddenly, and therefore they are associated with hidden knowledge and dangerous power. And when we look at the Serpent Mound from this perspective, we can begin to understand it not as a bizarre anomaly, but as one expression of a much larger spiritual and cultural tradition that spanned an entire continent and an enormous span of time. And the question then becomes whether the serpent at Serpent Mound was connected to this broader mythology, and whether it represented a specific myth or legend that was understood across multiple cultures and multiple regions, and whether the builders of the serpent knew about the horned serpent traditions of cultures to the south and to the east and to the west, and the answer is that we simply do not know, and we cannot know without the testimony of the people who built it, and yet the fact that serpent symbolism appears so consistently and so broadly across so many different Native American cultures suggests that there was indeed a continental conversation happening, a sharing of spiritual ideas and mythological concepts that moved along the same trade routes that brought shells and copper and cacao from distant lands. And if this is true, then the Serpent Mound becomes not merely a local monument, but a monument that participates in a truly Pan-American tradition, and we must now turn our attention to the question of what happened to these civilizations and why they declined, and why the great city of Cahokia that had hosted 20,000 souls and built monuments that rival the works of Egypt would eventually be abandoned and left to the forest. And the decline of Cahokia happened gradually over the course of 2 centuries, beginning around the year 1200 AD and accelerating through the 1300s, and by 1400 the city was essentially empty, and the people had dispersed into the surrounding regions, and this represents perhaps the most dramatic urban collapse in North American history before the arrival of Europeans. And scholars have proposed many theories for why Cahokia failed, and one prominent theory focuses on environmental degradation, and specifically on deforestation, and the people of Cahokia required enormous amounts of wood for construction and for fuel, and for heating their homes in winter, and they lived in a region that was already somewhat marginal for large-scale agriculture, and if the forests around the city were depleted faster than they could regenerate, this would have created a resource crisis that would have been extremely difficult to overcome, and the pollen records from lake sediments suggest that deforestation around Cahokia was indeed severe. And a second theory emphasizes flooding, and the Mississippi River is known for catastrophic floods that can destroy crops and communities, and if a series of major floods damaged the city and destroyed its agricultural base over a period of years, this could have created the conditions for social collapse. And a third theory focuses on drought, and paleoclimate evidence suggests that the period around 1200 to 1400 AD was characterized by increasing aridity in much of the Mississippi Valley, and if the climate became drier, agricultural productivity would have declined, and this would have reduced the food surplus that the elite class depended on to maintain their authority. And a fourth theory emphasizes social and political factors, and suggests that the rigid hierarchy of Cahokian society eventually became oppressive and untenable, and that the common people eventually rejected the authority of the ruling class and abandoned the city rather than continue to labor for people who were hoarding resources and making unjust demands. And there is evidence of violence in the archaeological record, and some areas of the city show signs of burning and destruction, and some scholars have proposed that internal conflict may have contributed to the city's collapse. And most likely the truth involves some combination of these factors, and a civilization as large and as complex as Cahokia would have been vulnerable to multiple simultaneous stresses, and if any 3 or 4 of these problems occurred at the same time, the system could have catastrophically collapsed, and the fascinating and poignant aspect of Cahokia's collapse is that it did not represent the extinction of the people who built it, and the Mississippian culture did not vanish from North America, and instead it fragmented and dispersed, and the people who had lived in Cahokia and in the satellite settlements of the Mississippian civilization moved outward, and they carried with them their cultural practices and their traditions and their knowledge. And they carried the memory of the great mounds and the great plazas, and they carried the spiritual practices that had been developed over centuries, and over subsequent generations they formed new communities and new societies, and they became the ancestors of the tribes that Europeans would encounter when they arrived on this continent. And many scholars believe that the Osage and the Omaha and the Ponca and the Quapaw and other Great Plains and Southeast tribes all trace their ancestry back to Cahokian refugees. And this means that the Mississippian civilization did not disappear, and it transformed, and it adapted, and it persisted in new forms in new locations, and the spiritual traditions of the mound builders were carried forward into the ceremonies and mythologies of the historic tribes that would resist European colonization. And now we arrive at the crucial moment in our story where we must ask the essential question. Was the Serpent Mound built by the Adena, and was it already ancient when the Hopewell peoples arrived, or was it built by the Hopewell themselves? Or was it perhaps even built by the Mississippian peoples as a monument to honour the earlier traditions of their ancestors? And the answer is that we do not know for certain, and the radiocarbon dating is inconclusive, and different experts have proposed different dates spanning more than 2,000 years. And the physical characteristics of the mound offer some clues but not definitive proof. And yet what we can say is that regardless of which culture built it was built by people who understood themselves to be part of a long tradition of mound building and astronomical observation and spiritual devotion to the forces of nature. And it was built by a people who understood the serpent to be a creature of profound spiritual significance. And the makers of the Serpent Mound saw something in the form of the serpent that merited the investment of enormous labour and resources, and something that they felt needed to be expressed in earthen form on the top of this sacred hill in Ohio, and it was meant to endure, and it was meant to speak to future generations about the values and beliefs of the people who built it. And there's one more piece to this puzzle, and it connects the Serpent Mound to something happening right now, today, in the 21st century, and this piece involves a discovery that was made only in recent decades, and a truth that has been slowly and reluctantly acknowledged by the academic community, and a truth that changes everything we thought we knew about who built the Serpent Mound and why they built it. And for centuries, white Americans assumed that the Serpent Mound was too sophisticated to have been built by Native Americans, and they attributed it to the lost civilization of the mound builders, and they imagined this civilization to be distant in time and exotic in origin, and they speculated about whether it might have been built by Egyptians or Phoenicians or Vikings or some other old world people who had sailed to America and left behind this monument before disappearing into legend, and they did this despite the fact that mounds were still being built and maintained by living Native American peoples, and despite the fact that the archaeological record showed a clear continuity of mound-building traditions in this region stretching back millennia. And the reason for this strange skepticism about Native American accomplishment has to do with racism and colonialism, and with the desire of white Americans to deny that the native peoples of this continent were capable of building sophisticated civilizations. And it was easier to think that the serpent was built by some vanished race of superior beings than to acknowledge that it was built by the ancestors of the people who were being displaced and dispossessed by European settlement. But over the last 50 years or so, the racism in American archaeology has been gradually confronted, and the field has become more rigorous, and the evidence has become overwhelming, and now the academic consensus is completely clear. The Serpent Mound was built by indigenous peoples of North America, and most likely by the Adena or Hopewell peoples, and it was built as part of a long tradition of mound building that characterized these cultures, and this tradition had clear antecedents in earlier Archaic period peoples, and it had clear successors in the Mississippian civilization that would come after, and the Serpent Mound is not a mystery that requires explanation by alien visitations or Old World civilizations, and it is instead a testament to the sophistication and the spiritual depth and the engineering capability of the indigenous peoples of North America. And when we understand this, the Serpent Mound becomes not a strange anomaly, but a beautiful and appropriate expression of the cultures that created it and maintained it and walked around it under the stars, and it becomes a symbol of a continent-spanning civilization that was every bit as sophisticated and every bit as complex as any civilization that existed anywhere in the world at that same moment in history, and it becomes a reminder of what was lost when European colonization began, and it becomes a sacred site that deserves to be honored and protected and understood, not as a curiosity but as a masterpiece of human achievement and spiritual expression. And as we lie here in the darkness listening to these words, we might picture ourselves standing at the entrance to the Serpent Mound, and we might see it not as it appears today, weathered and worn, but as it looked on the day it was completed, and the earth is still raw, and the serpent's outline is sharp and clear against the night sky. And if we look up into the night sky, the stars shine down on this creation with the same light that would have shone down on the people who built it, and the same cosmic rhythms that govern their lives continue to govern ours across the centuries, and we are connected to them across 2,000 years by this earthen serpent, and by the mystery of why they chose to create this form, and leave it here for us to find, and for us to wonder about, and for us to protect, and to honour. And the Serpent Mound stands as a testament to a way of thinking about the world that is fundamentally different from the way we think about it today. And the peoples who built this monument lived in a world that was alive with spiritual presence, and the animals and the plants and the natural forces were not merely resources to be exploited, but beings to be respected and understood. And the serpent was one of these beings, and it held a power and a significance that went far beyond the merely physical. And when we stand at the Serpent Mound, we are standing in the presence of 2,000 years of human tradition and belief, and we are standing in the presence of a people who understood that some things are worth building, even if those things take 200 years to complete, and even if no single person will ever live to see the project finished. And we are standing in the presence of a philosophy that says that the spiritual world and the physical world are connected, and that the earth beneath our feet is not inert and passive, but alive and responsive to the intentions and actions of human beings. And when the Adena, or Hopewell, or perhaps the Mississippian peoples carved this serpent into the hill, they were making a statement about their understanding of the universe, and they were creating a monument that would speak across the centuries to anyone who came after them. And they were saying something like this: we understand the serpent as a sacred creature, and we understand the transformation and the mystery and the hidden power that it represents, and we are willing to invest our labour and our resources to express this understanding in a form that will endure, and we are planting a message here in the earth, and we are trusting that someday, thousands of years in the future, there will be people who will see this serpent and will remember what it means, and will honour the sacred tradition that connects us all together across time. And there's one more piece to this puzzle, and it connects the Serpent Mound to something happening right now, today, in the 21st century. But here's what matters most right now, as you stand on this ridge in the gathering dusk, feeling the weight of history beneath your feet and time stretching behind you into countless centuries of human experience and struggle and a memory and connection. The Serpent Mound isn't just a relic locked away behind museum glass untouched and forgotten, and left to decay slowly in some climate-controlled room, far from this land where it was built and shaped with intention and vision and spiritual purpose. It's alive in ways that statistics and academic papers cannot possibly capture or explain to those who haven't stood on this ground and felt the presence of time. It's alive in the memories and ceremonies of the people whose ancestors built it across 13 centuries ago through vision and labour and community determination and sacred knowledge passed down through generations without interruption. The Shawnee Nation still exists today with thousands of members. The Miami still exist and thrive. The Osage still exist and maintain their traditions and ceremonies. The Cherokee still exist and carry their knowledge forward into the future. Their descendants walk this earth every single day, carrying in their hearts the memory of ancestors who built monuments and shaped the land. And many of them remember what their ancestors knew about this place, and this serpent, and these sacred lands that were stolen from them by force and policy and broken treaties. Not just in dusty archive documents or oral histories passed down through generations, though those matter deeply and preserve crucial knowledge systems and spiritual wisdom encoded in language. They remember in their bones and their blood and their direct connection to place. They remember in their genetic memory. They remember in the sacred knowledge that has never died even when written records tried to erase it violently and completely and utterly through suppression. When Shawnee people lead ceremonies at Serpent Mound today, they aren't recreating something lost in time and recovered by academic scholars from old texts and research. They're continuing something that never truly stopped moving, and never truly disappeared from the world in the spiritual realm. The continuity was broken by force and Indian removal policies, and centuries of violent suppression and attempted genocide. But the thread was never completely severed and broken beyond repair. The tradition persisted underground through whispered stories and keeping the sacred fire alive, and was kept alive in hearts and families despite everything they suffered and everything they lost. The Miami Nation has fought for decades and generations for recognition of their ancestral connections to these mounds and earthworks scattered across the landscape of what is now Ohio and Indiana. They've documented their historical presence in these lands through genealogy, an oral tradition, an archaeological collaboration with researchers who listen and respect their voices and their knowledge. They've explained their relationships to the places where their ancestors lived and worked, and performed sacred ceremonies and hunted game and raised families for thousands of years. The Osage, whose lands once stretched across millions of acres from the Great Plains to the Mississippi River in a vast domain, maintain traditions tied to earthworks and astronomical alignments that predate European contact by thousands of years and many centuries. Their stories preserve knowledge of how their ancestors understood the cosmos and their place within it, and how they oriented their lives and their communities toward the stars. The Cherokee oral traditions speak of great serpent figures, of water serpents, of forces that shaped the landscape and controlled waters and rivers and creeks, long before colonial ships arrived on distant shores carrying conquest and disease and devastation and death. These aren't footnotes or addendums to be considered optional or secondary to the main narrative of American history. These aren't supplementary materials or alternative interpretations that scholars might debate in journals from their offices and universities. They are the story itself. This is the heart. This is the core. This is where we confront something uncomfortable and necessary about how history gets told in America and what narratives we choose to believe and validate and teach our children. For centuries, Americans have treated the mounds as mysteries to be solved by outsiders, as puzzles for white academics to debate in peer-reviewed journals and university classrooms far removed from this place and the people who live here. But the people who hold the answers have always been here. They were never silent. We simply refused to listen and refused to value their knowledge and their understanding. We chose not to listen. We built institutions that didn't include their voices. We created frameworks that invalidated theirs. We then acted shocked that we couldn't understand what they could have taught us if we had asked humbly and with respect. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, passed in 1990 after decades of dedicated activist work and fighting, gave Native nations legal rights to recover human remains and sacred objects from museums and institutions across the country, serving as repositories and warehouses. It sounds straightforward on paper when you read the language. In practice, it's been a grinding, exhausting battle for justice and basic dignity and recognition of rights that should have never been taken in the first place. Tribes had to fight hard to prove cultural and historical affiliation with remains and artifacts taken from their lands without permission or consent or respect or consideration. They had to navigate bureaucratic systems designed without them and against their interests and deliberately designed to maintain the status quo and protect institutional interests. They had to overcome skepticism and hostility from archaeologists who viewed indigenous peoples as incapable of understanding their own history and their own sacred sites and their own knowledge. They had to demand respect for their expertise about their own cultures, and yet they did it despite all obstacles. Every year more is accomplished and more bones come home to their families and communities. Bones stored away in basements for decades and locked in storage facilities are being returned to their communities for proper treatment. Sacred objects are going home to where they belong and where they have power. Remains are being reburied in ceremonies that honour them properly and with respect for the first time in generations or centuries or even longer. These ceremonies matter profoundly and deeply. This isn't logistics or procedure or bureaucracy. This is justice finally being served. This is restoration of dignity long denied. This is acknowledgement that these people were sacred and worthy of respect and were never meant to be studied like specimens in jars. When Serpent Mound was threatened with development decades ago, local people and concerned citizens fought to preserve it from destruction and exploitation and industrial transformation. But today, native nations push for something deeper and more meaningful than just preservation as a museum piece. They want recognition as the cultural heirs to these earthworks and these lands. They want their voices at the table for preservation and research decisions and public interpretation and presentation. They want the narrative to shift from mystery solved by science to knowledge held in community and ceremony and tradition and tested over millennia of human experience. This shift is beginning to happen in real and measurable ways across the country. Some researchers now work collaboratively with tribal nations, returning respect and authority that should have always been theirs from the beginning. Some museums employ tribal members to guide interpretation and provide cultural context and meaning that outsiders can never fully understand without lived experience. Some universities acknowledge that indigenous knowledge systems are legitimate and valid ways of understanding the past and present and future. It's slow progress, it's incomplete and ongoing, but it's real and it's happening. When you listen to Shawnee elders talk about the serpent and what it means, when you hear Miami Nation members describe their deep connection to these lands and their ancestors, when you encounter Cherokee traditions about water spirits and earth forces and cosmic relationships, you're hearing a different kind of knowledge entirely. Not the kind that can be measured and dated and fitted into academic papers and journal articles written by academics in distant universities. The kind that lives in place and is inseparable from the land. The kind that understands landscape as a text that speaks in multiple languages at once to those who know how to listen. The kind that recognizes sacredness and spirituality as valid and powerful frameworks for understanding the world and humanity's relationship to it. Meanwhile, something remarkable is happening in archaeology, though most people don't know about it or understand its implications for how we see America. The old tools are being replaced by new ones that reveal what was always hidden beneath vegetation and soil and centuries of growth and forest cover. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, shoots millions of laser pulses through forest canopy at incredible speeds, processing the returns. Those pulses bounce off ground, creating detailed three-dimensional maps of terrain that humans can't see without this revolutionary technology. The trees that hide the landscape from human eyes become completely transparent to the laser-revealing structures long hidden, and what's revealed is absolutely stunning beyond comprehension or expectation. Thousands of mounds and earthworks and structures that archaeologists never knew existed before this technology became available. Not vague possibilities or theories. Concrete evidence visible in the data and the maps and the numbers. In 2021, researchers using LiDAR in northwest Arkansas found evidence of an enormous pre-Columbian settlement with thousands of earthworks spread across the landscape in elaborate patterns. Not just ceremonial mounds for special occasions separated from daily life. An entire built landscape with precision and planning. An urban area. Cities that rivaled contemporary European towns in sophistication and scale and organization and complexity. Cities that would have taken centuries to build and maintain. That discovery forced complete recalibration of what scholars thought they knew about indigenous societies in North America and their capabilities. The old model assumed smaller dispersed populations scattered across the land with minimal organization. The new evidence suggests sophistication and population density rivaling European cities of the same period and even exceeding them. And Arkansas wasn't unique in any way or exceptional. LiDAR surveys across the continent are revealing that Mississippian culture, ancestral Puebloans, Fremont, Hohokam, and dozens of other cultures built cities and landscapes on a scale rivaling anything in the Old World or Europe at the same time period. The Great Serpent Mound might not have been isolated, standing alone. It might have been part of a landscape covered with earthworks, some known, some forgotten, some still undiscovered. Some may lie beneath forests we walk through today. Some may have been ploughed under by agriculture and development. Some may still be waiting to be seen by eyes equipped with technology to perceive them. Ground-penetrating radar is another game-changer in this technological revolution, changing our fundamental understanding of what we thought we knew. This technology sends electromagnetic waves into Earth deep below the surface and measures the returns. Those waves bounce off objects underground, creating detailed images of buried structures without any excavation required. No digging required, no damage to the fragile site, just pure information from below the surface revealed through physics and data interpretation. Archaeologists using ground-penetrating radar at various mound sites have found evidence of internal structures, chambers, ramps, and complex arrangements that completely change how we understand why mounds were built and what purposes they served in their communities. A mound might contain internal ramps carved into the earth for ceremonial purposes, or ritual processions conducted by community members in sacred configurations. A mound might have multiple distinct phases of construction spanning decades or centuries of work and community effort and planning across generations. A mound might be oriented towards specific celestial bodies and astronomical events like summer solstice or winter solstice or cardinal directions. A mound might incorporate water features or astronomical calculators built into its geometry. These discoveries matter profoundly. They change everything about how we see these structures and their builders, and new discoveries are happening constantly year after year as more teams get access to this technology. In 2023 and 2024, teams exploring previously uninvestigated areas found mounds never catalogued before by official archaeology. Some are in locations that challenge existing theories about settlement patterns and trade routes, and cultural interaction between distant communities. Some show evidence of astronomical alignments no one suspected existed in those locations. Some reveal construction techniques we're still working to understand and document and interpret for what they tell us. We're like people reading a book in near total darkness, gradually scanning a flashlight across pages, learning as we go. Every year the flashlight reveals more text, more detail, more complexity hidden in the data and the earth. But we're still seeing only fragments of the whole intricate system. Most of the book remains in shadow. Most of the narrative remains untold and waiting for discovery by future generations with better tools and clearer vision. Think about this carefully and let it change fundamentally how you see America and its history. The people who built the Serpent Mound were part of a civilizational tradition that spanned thousands of years and covered millions of acres across the continent in intricate networks. The Earthworks tradition in North America goes back at least 5,000 years with archaeological evidence, possibly longer with oral traditions, maybe 6,000 years. That's longer than the pyramids of Egypt were built, longer than Stonehenge was constructed, longer than the Great Wall of China was assembled, longer than ancient Rome existed from founding to fall, longer than recorded history in Europe even began to be written, and yet it's barely taught in American schools and barely mentioned in textbooks. Most Americans know more about Easter Island and its moai than Serpent Mound right here in America. Most people could describe Egyptian mummies and their wrapping in detail, but couldn't describe a single indigenous earthwork native to their own continent. That's not accidental or random. It's a deliberate choice about whose history matters and whose can be forgotten and erased. But the forgetting is ending. Not completely. Not fast enough for those who care. But it's ending now. The Shawnee are here. The Miami are here. The Osage are here. The Cherokee are here. Their ancestors built these earthworks with vision and purpose. Their traditions preserve knowledge about them and about the cosmos. Their ceremonies continue year after year. Their voices are being heard now in universities and museums, and increasingly archaeologists are recognizing that the best way to understand these sites isn't to exclude these indigenous voices, but to center them in the conversation and in the research. Which brings us to UNESCO World Heritage status that could transform everything about how this site is perceived and protected. In 2022, Serpent Mound was placed on America's tentative list for UNESCO World Heritage Sites recognition and consideration. If approved, and advocates say it's likely in the coming years and decades it will join the Great Pyramid of Giza, Stonehenge, Machu Picchu, the Taj Mahal and the Great Wall in the pantheon of globally recognized wonders. Think about that placement carefully. That's the company this earthwork keeps among the greatest human achievements. The irony is exquisite and bitter, and makes you think about what we've overlooked. This earthwork has survived 1,300 years in the American landscape mostly unnoticed. It's been a feature of these hills and valleys since before the Founding Fathers were even born. Countless thousands have driven past it on Highway 124 without a thought or second glance. Countless thousands have lived within sight of it their entire lives in nearby towns and farms, and yet most never noticed or cared. Most drove right past without seeing what was there. A UNESCO designation would change that fundamentally and completely. It would bring international attention and recognition. It would bring increased funding for research and preservation efforts. It would bring better legal protection from development and industrial encroachment. It would mean Americans and people worldwide would finally acknowledge this matters. This is important. This is a wonder, equal to the works of ancient Egypt or medieval Europe or the Han dynasty. The fact that this needs an international designation to be taken seriously says something damning and troubling about how America has failed to honour its own deep history. But at least recognition is finally coming now. At least there's hope that children will learn about Serpent Mound in schools. At least there's a possibility that people won't drive past it in ignorance anymore. The bigger picture is crucial to understand everything about America and its deep history. North America has been continuously inhabited for at least 15,000 years, with archaeological evidence. That's the conservative estimate that scholars across disciplines agree upon cautiously. Some evidence suggests humans were here 23,000 years ago, or longer, but conservatively 15,000 years of continuous habitation by humans on this continent. That means people have been living here longer than almost anywhere else on Earth continuously, longer than Europe was inhabited, longer than East Asia developed civilization, longer than agriculture started in Mesopotamia, and all that time is part of American history and heritage, not prehistory as a dismissive category, actual history, actual civilization, actual culture and achievements spanning millennia and generations without end. The Serpent Mound builders were part of one chapter in an epic, sprawling narrative that continues to this day. There were cultures before them building and creating and developing in this land. The fort ancient culture rose and fell, leaving traces in the landscape for us to discover. The Adena culture built mounds and had sophisticated trade networks spanning vast distances from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. The Mississippian culture created massive earthen cities, with populations rivaling European cities of the same time period. The ancestral Puebloans built cliff dwellings and created great roads connecting communities, civilizations as sophisticated and organized as anything in Europe or Asia of the same era. And there were cultures after them who lived on this same land. The Shawnee arrived in the Ohio Valley bringing their traditions and ceremonies. The Cherokee, Lenape, Wyandot, Kickapoo arrived at different times on this continent carrying their knowledge and understanding. Each nation brought its own rich traditions and knowledge systems refined over centuries. Each brought its own deep understanding of this land and its forces. Each recognized the earthworks before them and understood their significance. Each incorporated mounds into their own sacred geography and spiritual practice. The landscape became a palimpsest of meaning layered across time, with each generation adding depth. Every generation added something valuable to the conversation with the land. Every generation interpreted what came before through their own framework and understanding. The Serpent Mound wasn't a static monument frozen in time, unchanged and empty. It was a living feature of a living landscape pulsing with meaning. It was reinterpreted and re-experienced by successive generations of people who came to this place. All of those people understood it as meaningful and sacred, worthy of respect and ceremony. That's crucial to understanding what we're dealing with here. We stand on a threshold in how America understands its past and its role in the world. On one side is the old model of understanding that dominated scholarship for centuries, the Serpent Mound as an isolated mystery with no explanation possible. The mound builders as people who vanished, leaving only questions and silence. The assumption that we would never truly know. On the other side is a newer model emerging from collaboration and listening, one where mounds are part of a living tradition continuing today with power and meaning, where people who built them haven't disappeared but endured and survived and kept the knowledge alive, where indigenous knowledge holders are experts equal to any academic scholar, where mystery and certainty coexist peacefully together on the same ground, sharing space and validity. This threshold moment is happening now in real time. It's not in the past. It's not guaranteed to go in one direction or guaranteed to succeed. The old model still dominates much of American education and thinking and institutional power, but the newer model is rising and gaining ground, and every person who visits Serpent Mound and listens to the people who belong here contributes to this shift in understanding and perspective. Every act of listening is an act of decolonization. Now let's bring you back to where you started this long journey through time and memory and understanding and transformation. You're standing on the ridge above Ohio Brush Creek as the sun hangs low, painting the sky with brilliant colors that almost hurt to look at directly. The light has turned amber and gold and rose and deep purple all at once in the western sky, fading into twilight. You can feel the last warmth soaking into your skin like a benediction from the earth itself, a final gift before the night descends. The serpent curves beneath your feet, invisible in the grass and soil, but you know it's there now in a way you didn't before this day of learning. You can sense the intention that shaped this land 13 centuries ago by people whose names are lost but whose vision persists. You don't know the name of the person who conceived it first. You don't know whether it was calculated precisely with mathematical knowledge or dreamed in visions and revealed in dreams. You don't know why the serpent faces this direction, why it curves through these specific valleys with such precision, why this location was chosen above all others. The mystery remains beautifully intact and perhaps should remain so, but you know something important now that will stay with you. You know this serpent matters deeply. You know that human beings walked this earth and created meaning and left marks on the landscape that endure. The sun is sinking lower and lower below the horizon. The shadows stretch long and dark across the mounds and the grass. The crickets begin their evening song all around you, filling the air with sound. Ohio Brush Creek murmurs over stones below the ridge, carrying water toward the ocean. The sky shifts from gold to purple to violet to black as night approaches. The first stars emerge and twinkle overhead in the deepening darkness.